When most people picture first century Judea, they picture sandals and sermons, dusty roads, fishing villages, parables about seeds and soil. What they miss is the silver. First century Judea was not primarily a spiritual landscape. It was an economic one, a province at the edge of the Roman Empire, structured, deliberately, precisely, to move resources from the people who produced them to the people who governed them. The poverty wasn't accidental. The debt wasn't a personal failure. The hunger wasn't bad luck. It was all structural, required by the system, and the system had been designed that way on purpose. This is where things get uncomfortable. Because once you see the economic machinery running underneath the most well-known story in Western history, you cannot unsee it. And nothing looks quite as simple as it did before. Thank you for being here. It means more than you know. Welcome to Hidden Ledger, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. If this is the kind of history you've been looking for, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Every video is another page of the ledger, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching this from. This channel reaches people across dozens of countries right now, all sitting with the same ideas at the same time. I want to see the map. Tell me your city. Start with the basic architecture. By the 1st century CE, Judea had been absorbed into the Roman provincial system. Rome was not simply a military power. It was an administrative and financial one. Provinces existed to generate revenue for the center. That was the point of them. The extraction worked through layers. At the top, Rome, which set the overall tax burden and demanded payment regardless of local conditions. Below that, the local administrative structure, including the temple authorities in Jerusalem, who operated under Roman approval and collected their own set of obligations. And at the bottom, the farmers, the fishermen, the small traders and craftspeople who actually produced the wealth that the layers above them consumed. The taxes were multiple and unforgiving. There was a land tax, a percentage of agricultural output, owed regardless of whether the harvest was good or poor. A head tax, levied simply for existing within Roman jurisdiction. Toll taxes on movement and trade, and separate religious obligations, tithes and temple dues, running alongside the Roman system simultaneously. A Galilean farming family in the 1st century was not paying one form of tax. They were paying several, to different authorities, with different collection dates, whether or not the rains had come that year. When the harvest failed, there was no relief built into the system. The obligation remained, the only option was to borrow. This is where the debt cycle begins, and once it starts, it is very difficult to stop. Rome did not typically collect taxes directly. It used a system called tax farming. The right to collect taxes in a given region was sold, usually by auction, to a private individual or group. The tax farmer paid Rome up front, then went out and collected from the population, keeping the difference as profit. The incentive built into this arrangement is obvious. The more you collect above what you paid Rome, the more you keep. There was no ceiling on what a tax farmer could extract, and there was limited accountability for how the collection happened. Tax collectors in this system were not public servants with a salary. They were entrepreneurs with a license. Their profit came directly from the gap between what they owed Rome and what they could squeeze from the people below them. For the farming family that could not meet its obligations, the next step was a loan, usually from a local landowner or creditor, secured typically against the land itself. If the loan could not be repaid, and in an environment of multiple overlapping obligations and unpredictable harvests, many could not, the land passed to the creditor. The family remained to work it, now as tenants rather than owners, paying a portion of their output as rent on top of whatever taxes they still owed. This process, debt leading to land loss leading to tenancy generating less income to service remaining obligations, which leads to more debt, repeated across enough families, across enough generations, produces something that modern economists would recognize immediately: land consolidation. A small number of large landowners absorbing the holdings of many small ones. An economy where the people doing the productive work own less and less of what they produce. This was not a side effect of the Roman system. It was a feature of it. The structure was designed to produce exactly this outcome. Now here is where the picture gets more complex. Because the temple in Jerusalem was not simply a house of worship. It was a treasury, a bank, a tax authority, and a financial institution operating under the protection of the most powerful military force in the ancient world. The temple held the accumulated wealth of centuries of religious donation. It provided a secure storage facility for private deposits. Wealthy families and institutions kept their valuables there under temple protection. It operated a system of lending, and it administered the annual temple tax, a half-shekel payment required of every adult Jewish male, used to fund the temple's operations and the sacrificial system. This is where the money changers come in, and the detail matters. The temple tax could not be paid in just any currency. It had to be paid in the Tyrian shekel, a specific silver coin minted in the Phoenician city of Tyre, valued for its consistent silver content at a time when many other coins were being debased. The Roman coinage in everyday circulation, the coins people actually had in their pockets, was not acceptable for the temple tax. So, when pilgrims arrived in Jerusalem for the major festivals, they needed to exchange their everyday currency for Tyrian shekels before they could fulfill their religious obligation. The money changers in the temple courts provided that exchange, at a fee. Access to religious participation was monetized. The spiritual obligation had a transaction cost attached to it. The high priests who administered this system were not independent religious authorities. They were appointed with Roman approval, selected, in part, for their ability to maintain order and ensure the revenue flows that Rome depended on continued without disruption. The relationship between the temple leadership and the Roman administration was not purely spiritual. It was financial and political. Each needed the other. The temple provided legitimacy and stability. Rome provided the security that kept the whole structure intact. With this context, one of the most well-known scenes in the gospel accounts reads differently. The overturning of the money changers' tables in the temple courts was not primarily an emotional outburst about disrespect in a holy place. Read through an economic lens, it was a direct confrontation with the machinery of extraction that sat at the center of the system, bearing down on the people in the surrounding region. The money changers were the visible, accessible face of a financial structure that linked Roman taxation to temple administration, to local debt cycles, to land consolidation. They were, literally, the point where the system required ordinary people to convert their resources into the specific instrument the institution demanded, at a price the institution set, in a space the institution controlled. The act of overturning those tables in the temple during the festival season when Jerusalem was at its most crowded and the commercial activity of the money changers was at its peak was a symbolic attack on the entire architecture of monetized access and financial intermediation that the temple courts represented. This interpretation is supported by something else the accounts record. Many of the teachings delivered in the same period used economic language that the audience would have heard in very literal terms. When debt forgiveness was discussed, the people listening were not processing it as a metaphor. They were people who owed actual debts. People whose land tenure depended on whether those debts could be serviced. People for whom the word forgiveness had a specific, practical, urgent meaning that had nothing to do with abstraction. The spiritual and the economic were not separate registers for the people in that audience. They were the same conversation. The system that produced these conditions did not last indefinitely. By 66 CE, the accumulated pressure of Roman extraction, temple financial administration, debt cycles, and land consolidation had created a population with very little left to lose. The Jewish revolt that began in that year was not simply a religious or nationalist uprising. It was the outcome of a social and economic structure that had pushed too many people too far for too long. The revolt ended with the Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. The temple, the treasury, the bank, the tax authority, the financial center of the entire provincial system was destroyed. The wealth accumulated over centuries was taken to Rome. The Arch of Titus, still standing in Rome today, depicts the temple menorah being carried through the streets in triumph. The system had collapsed, not because it ran out of silver, because it ran out of the one thing every extraction system ultimately depends on: the willingness of the people inside it to continue accepting the moral narrative that justified it. When enough people stopped believing that the obligations being demanded of them were legitimate, when the gap between the system's claims about itself and the reality of how it actually operated became too wide to maintain, the whole structure became unstable. That is not a lesson unique to first century Judea. It is the lesson that every financial system built on extraction eventually encounters, at the point when the moral narrative that holds it together stops working. The first century in Judea was not a simple story about faith versus empire. It was a story about what happens when taxation, debt, land consolidation, and monetized religious obligation stack on top of each other, when the people doing the producing end up owning less and less of what they produce, while the layers above them extract more and more. It was a story about the point where a system's internal logic and its moral justification diverge so completely that the structure can no longer hold itself together. And it was a story about language, about the fact that when you hear words like forgiveness and debt in an audience of people who are literally indebted, literally at risk of losing their land, literally one failed harvest away from losing everything, those words carry a weight that abstract interpretation cannot reach. The economic machinery was always there, running underneath the sermons and the parables and the dust and the silver. Most readings of this history never look at it. This one did. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.